Now let me move on and introduce our presenter for today, Dr. Mikhail Sergeyev, born in the Soviet Union, came to the United States, lives today in Philadelphia. He has a master's degree and doctorate in religious studies and in philosophy of religion, in the case of his doctorate from Temple University in Philadelphia. He's written quite a few articles on quite a wide variety of subjects. He's very interested in history of religion, philosophy. He and I were just talking about the afterlife just now. He's even interested in contemporary art. He publishes in Russian and in English, and for all I know, perhaps other languages as well. Various books of his, 7 altogether. Theory of Religious Cycles, Tradition, Modernity, and the Baha'i Faith came out through Brill in 2015. I remember looking that manuscript over. It was quite interesting. He teaches currently at the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, and he's also co-chair of the Wilmot Institute's own Department of Religion, Philosophy, and Theology. So he does many different things and is really quite a remarkable thinker and speaker, and we're looking forward to hearing him today. Welcome, Mikhail. It's good to see you again, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
So let me begin. The aim of my presentation is to examine the problems of human self-identity and immortality as they are approached in transhumanism and the Baha'i writings. I find this topic fascinating because I believe that transhumanism is probably the most avant-garde and, as young people would say, the coolest cultural movement of the first quarter of the 21st century. So what is transhumanism? Transhumanism, or H+, is an intellectual and cultural movement whose ultimate goal is to merge biology with computer technology in order to enhance human capabilities and in the long run to achieve human immortality. Now, who were the precursors of transhumanists? Transhumanists trace their origin to the undertaking in the intercivilizational efforts to curb aging and conquer death, which was always one of the highest human aspirations. Those aspirations go back to ancient Egypt and China, and to the search for the fountain of youth, or the alchemist's elixir of immortality, or elixir of life. One of the more immediate precursors to the philosophy of transhumanism was a 19th century Russian Orthodox thinker, Nicholas Fiodarov. Now, probably most of my viewers today have never heard of this guy, but in Russia he was quite famous, not only because of his philosophy. He was a very strange man who knew 20 languages, worked in the library. He was a librarian who was very poor, who worked without any coat during the Russian winters, and who dreamed of the science of the future that will be able to resurrect everyone who has ever lived on Earth. So he was advocating radical life extension, physical immortality, including even resurrection of the dead using scientific means. Now, by many Russian contemporaries, and he was a good friend with Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, who admired him, but by many Russian contemporaries, he was seen as kind of a marginal thinker who was dreaming of something that is completely impossible. But at least one practical thing came out of his teachings. He became the inspirer of those Russian scientists who created Russian space travel. Because Nicholas Fyodorov was so preoccupied with resurrecting everyone that he seriously thought about the possibility that all those resurrected people will not be able to live on Earth. So he thought that we will need space travel, and we have to colonize other planets in order to make sure that we have enough space to accommodate all those resurrected people. In 1923, in his essay, Daedalus, Science and the Future, the British geneticist Haldane outlined the basic ideas of transhumanism. And in 1957, biologist Julian Huxley, who is commonly credited as the founder of the movement, coined the term transhumanism. In the last decade of the 20th century, the efforts of individual thinkers began to coalesce into a coherent school of thought with the establishment of the World Transhumanist Association in 1998 and the issuing of Transhumanist Declaration in 2002. Now, according to one of the leading transhumanist thinkers, a contemporary British philosopher, Max Moore, I quote, "Transhumanism is a class of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and human limitations by means of science and technology guided by life-prolonging principles and values." The main philosophical assumption of transhumanism is that the functioning of the human brain is based on the same principles and is subordinated to the same procedures as the operation of a highly sophisticated computer with advanced capabilities. Now, the supposition that artificial and human intelligence are fundamentally identical is known as the Church-Turing Thesis that was independently advanced by an American mathematician and logician, Alonzo Church, and a British computer scientist, Alan Turing, back in 1937. While being harshly rebutted by its critics, it is still a working hypothesis for many scholars in the field of artificial intelligence. Now, let us review some of the key terms transhumanists use when they develop this approach in their writings. So the first one, Turing Test. In 1950, in his paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, Alan Turing articulated the standard by which to decide whether the machine does possess intelligence. According to Turing, the main criterion for judgment is purely empirical. If a person cannot distinguish his IT interlocutor from a human being, then the machine is intelligent and should be treated as such. The second one is Moore's Law. In 1965, a co-founder of Intel, Gordon Moore, observed that, I quote, transistors were shrinking so fast that every year twice as many could fit onto a chip, and in 1975 adjusted the pace to a doubling every 2 years, unquote. The rule of exponential growth of integrated circuits proved right for the last 50 years. And on the basis of that, many futurists predicted the soon-to-be dawning era of technological singularity. However, it seems that after half a century of triumph, Moore's Law may be running out of steam. The next one is whole brain emulation, or WBE. Another name is mind uploading, or mind transfer, or mind copying. This is an exact simulation or high-tech replica of the human brain. It is a hypothetical procedure of transferring mental content of the brain to an artificial neural network that will function in essentially the same way as the human original. Nowadays, it is not possible to do that, but futurists think that in the near future, soon, we will be able to achieve this capacity. Finally, technological singularity. In 1965, a British cryptologist, I.J. Good, formulated the idea of technological singularity, which suggested a possibility of merging human biology with computer technology. A resulting human hybrid, which is labeled sometimes post-human, sometimes transhuman, will possess a superhuman intelligence and capabilities, including the capacity to live an infinitely long life. If this happens, this being will achieve the ultimate dream of immortality, or at least practical immortality. Now, the concept of singularity, or the merging of human biology with computer technology, applies first and foremost to the brain, which is the conduit for human mind, for human consciousness, and for human self-identity. Hence, transhumanist thought gets inevitably involved in the millennia-old polemics about the origin of life and the nature of human soul. What happens if a person's brain is irreversibly damaged and replaced by its artificial duplicate? Will it be the same human being, or will it be a different one? Where exactly the seed of human identity could be found? According to a contemporary American inventor, transhumanist thinker, and best-selling author Ray Kurzweil, there are four competing theories of human identity or human selfhood. The first position, which Kurzweil confusingly labels the ego theory, I would prefer the soul theory, states that a person's nature is his or her soul or non-physical mind, and this mind or soul can survive the death of the body. The second position, called psychological continuity theory, argues that you are essentially your memories and ability to reflect on yourself. The founder of this theory was John Locke, a British philosopher of the 17th century. And until now, Locke's theory remains the most popular one among those who deal with artificial intelligence. So you are essentially your memories and ability to reflect on yourself, and more generally, your overall psychological configuration, what Kurzweil referred to as your pattern. Now, the third position would be that of materialism. The materialism thesis asserts that you are essentially the material that you are made out of, what Kurzweil referred to as the ordered and chaotic collection of molecules that make up my body and brain. Now, this position is evidently wrong, because we know now from science that our body is being recycled every 7 years, and therefore the material out of which our body is made every 7 years becomes different. So since it becomes different and your identity remains the same, it cannot be that our identity is based on the molecules. And Ray Kurzweil and practically all other transhumanist thinkers actually reject the materialist view. And finally, the fourth option, or the so-called no-self view, claims that there is no metaphysical category of person. The I is a grammatical fiction. That's what Nietzsche thought. Or there are bundles of impressions but no underlying self. That's what Hume proposed. So there is no survival because there is no person. And Ray Kurzweil thinks that that was the position of the Buddha. Now, I would disagree with this interpretation of Buddhism, but the idea behind the no-self theory is quite clear, that there is no one who will survive the death of the body. So most religions, including the Baha'i faith, take the first position, the soul theory, and affirm the existence of the human soul that is essentially different from the physical body. They contend that the soul is spiritual, that it survives the death of the body, and that it either follows the path of reincarnation, as the Hindus believe, or reunites with its body through resurrection, as Christians believe, or continues its evolution on the spiritual plane of existence, as Baha'is believe. There are transhumanists who believe in the spiritual nature of the soul as well, especially in the Christian intellectual tradition. There exists, for example, a Mormon transhumanist association, and this association advocates transfigurism as a religious brand of transhumanism. The Mormon Transhumanist Association, or MTA, website claims that this association is, I quote, the world's largest advocacy network for ethical use of technology and religion to expand human abilities, end quote, and that they support members in their personal religious affiliations, Mormon or otherwise, and also that they encourage them to adapt transhumanism to their unique situations. But I have to say that most of the transhumanists are secular people, with some rare notable exceptions. So here is one exception: a cosmologist and physicist who specializes in the general theory of relativity, Frank Tipler. Frank Tipler is perhaps the most prominent among contemporary Christian transhumanists. In his 1994 book, The Physics of Immortality, he proposed his own arguably scientific theory that links the Christian doctrine of bodily resurrection with the concepts of singularity and mind uploading. According to Tipler, human drive for total knowledge will eventually lead to what he calls the big crunch, or the omega point, a cosmological singularity when computational capabilities of the universe expand to infinity and transform it into a gigantic supercomputer. In such a scenario, the resurrection of the dead will happen within its cyberspace, where dead humans will be reconstructed as avatars inside what he calls the compuverse, computer universe. So the physical mechanism of individual resurrection, according to Tipler, will be virtual. Tipler argues that we shall be emulated in the computers of the far future. But as I said, he is just probably an exception. Most of the notable transhumanists are secular people, sometimes simply non-religious, sometimes agnostics, often atheists. With few exceptions, as contemporary British philosopher Max More says, I quote, transhumanists describe themselves as materialists, physicalists, or functionalists. As such, they believe that our thinking, feeling selves are essentially physical processes, unquote. For those secular transhumanists, the second position of psychological continuity is evidently preferable to the third and the fourth interpretation that eliminate the possibility for human self-identity to be relatively independent of and exist outside the human body. An ardent advocate of the second theory, Ray Kurzweil, argues that the pattern of human individuality could be eventually disassociated from its organic substratum and transferred into another, more durable technological platform. It is the first religious, and the second, secular, approaches to the problem of human identity that we are going to compare in this presentation. So here is Ray Kurzweil, a great American inventor. He is called today's Edison. He invented many things throughout his life, including the keyboard, for example. As far as I know, today he's working for Google, and he works with pattern recognition technology. His latest best-selling book is about how to create a mind. And if you've never read Ray Kurzweil, I highly recommend to read at least a couple of his books in order to understand his thinking, which is exciting, which is innovative, which is forward-looking. Now, in his best-selling books, an American inventor and transhumanist thinker, Ray Kurzweil, develops a series of arguments to prove the theoretical plausibility of singularity. That's what we will be concerned with, because in his books, he writes about many things. He's a very prolific author. But we are interested in his views on the possibility of singularity, and we are interested in his views on human nature and identity. So the most significant and philosophically far-reaching, as I said, topics are those of his ideas that deal with the concepts of evolution and self-identity. In his book, The Singularity is Near, Kurzweil defines evolution as, I quote, a process of creating patterns of increasing order, unquote, which store and transmit information. Kurzweil distinguishes 6 epochs, or ages, or eras, in the process of world evolution, beginning with atomic and molecular levels studied by physics, chemistry, biology, then the appearance of neural patterns and the brain, the development of information technology, and finally up to the future technological singularity and the waking up of the universe, when its matter and energy become saturated with intelligence processes and knowledge. One of the pressing issues in the discussion of evolution, as Kurzweil notes in one of his books, is whether, I quote, an intelligence can create another intelligence more intelligent than itself, unquote. He proposed solution to the problem, and his solution takes the form of 2 mutually related arguments. In their logical reconstruction, they run as follows. Number 1, the evolution is efficient but extremely slow. Number 2, given the long period of time it achieved its results, evolution's IQ, if we can say so, is only slightly greater than 0, if 0 stands for truly arbitrary behavior. Number 3, yet, evolution created human intelligence with higher IQ. Therefore, Kurzweil concludes, evolution can create something that is higher, greater than itself. And here comes the second argument that depends on the first argument, depends on the conclusion from the first argument. So it begins with the first premise that is actually the conclusion of the first argument. Evolution has created something higher than itself. Then the second premise, human intelligence is part of evolution. Number 3, human intelligence works at a much higher pace. Therefore, human intelligence can create machines that are higher than human intelligence. Now, having established the theoretical possibility of the supercomputer that will exceed human intelligence, Kurzweil now turns to the problem of human identity, which may be affected by the eventual merger of human biology with superior computer technology. Here he proposes two thought experiments that in their logical formulations look as follows. The first one begins with the first assumption. Let's assume that it is possible to scan and download a complete replica of the human brain. It is called brain emulation. So you too, another you, is behaving exactly like you. The question is it really you? Now, Kurzweil says that it seems that you too is another person and has a different identity. And then he comes to the second thought experiment. Now, let's assume that your brain is replaced part by part with implants until there is nothing original in your brain. Is this person still you or not you? In this case, Kurzweil says, you still exist, except for the fact that the conclusion of the thought experiment number 2 comes into contradiction with the thought experiment number 1. How should we resolve this contradiction? Now, Kurzweil's answer to the paradox is simple and quite straightforward. He believes that in both cases, we are dealing with one and the same person, and that you too of the first thought experiment is actually you, no matter how counterintuitive this may sound. This conclusion is based on Kurzweil's view on the nature of human identity that he himself calls patternist. As we remember, according to this position, a human being is a pattern of matter and energy that persists over time, and it can be emulated on a different non-organic platform. We will return to Kurzweil's arguments about evolution and self-identity when we compare his views with Baha'i approaches to the issues in question. In order to explore a Baha'i perspective with regard to transhumanist views and doctrines, we have to revisit briefly Baha'i teachings on human nature. We have to do this since this is the key topic in relation to both human evolution and self-identity. In his various talks, Abdul-Baha addresses the issue of human nature while focusing on three central themes. First, human nature has two components, material and spiritual, or as philosophers would say, body and soul. And here I have Abdul-Baha's quotation from Paris Talks. In man, there are two natures, he says, his spiritual or higher nature and his material or lower nature. Every good habit, every noble quality belongs to man's spiritual nature, whereas all imperfections and sinful actions are born of his material nature. In the promulgation of universal peace, Abdul-Baha affirms the same principle, I quote, man has two aspects, the physical, which is subject to nature, and the merciful or divine, which is connected with God, end quote. Now, the second theme that Abdul-Baha discusses when it comes to human nature is related to human character. Abdul-Baha points out to the complexities of human character by distinguishing the innate character, the inherited character, and the acquired character. The innate character reflects various abilities and inclinations people possess from their birth. As he says, I quote, although the innate nature bestowed by God upon men is purely good, yet that character differs among men according to the degrees they occupy, end quote. The inherited character depends on the strength and weakness of man's constitution, that is inborn from his parents. Here is another quotation from Abdul-Baha. If the parents are of weak constitution, then the children will be likewise, and if they are strong, then the children will also be robust, unquote. Finally, the acquired character is developed by education, and the difference of character arising from education are great, for education exerts an enormous influence. And finally, to the third theme that is discussed in Baha'i writings about human nature. Abdul-Baha here pays special attention to the interrelationship between human body, human mind, and human spirit. I quote, the human spirit which distinguishes man from the animal is the rational soul, he says. And these two terms, the human spirit and the rational soul, designate one and the same thing. As for the mind, it is the power of the human spirit. The spirit is as the lamp, and the mind as the light that shines from it. The mind is the perfection of the spirit and a necessary attribute thereof, even as the rays of the sun are an essential requirement of the sun itself, end quote. In the tablet to Dr. Forel, Abdul-Baha clarifies with more details this interconnection between body, mind, and its spirit or soul. Here is another quote. For the mind to manifest itself, the human body must be whole, and the sound mind cannot be but in a sound body, whereas the soul depends not upon the body. It is through the power of the soul that the mind comprehends, imagines, and exerts its influence, while the soul is a power that is free. The mind comprehends the abstract by the aid of the concrete, but the soul has limitless manifestations of its own. It is by the aid of such senses as those of sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch that mind comprehends, whereas the soul is free from all agencies, end quote. Now we can return to Kurzweil's argument about evolution and analyze it from a Baha'i perspective. Kurzweil's argument rests on an empirical observation that evolution works its way from simple to complex forms and produces human intelligence that is lacking in nature. Since man is a product and part of evolutionary process, it seems to follow that he himself could create an even higher intelligence and evolve into a super being that will supersede ordinary humans in physical and intellectual abilities. Let's discuss this initial proposition of the argument first. The observation about natural evolution is empirically correct, but logically ambiguous. If we accept evolution on its face value, then we necessarily arrive at a conclusion that a lesser entity can produce something that is greater than itself. At the end of the logical chain, however, it means that nothing can evolve into something which from a rational standpoint is quite absurd. The evolutionary surplus should come from somewhere. Either it potentially existed in nature and was actualized by evolution, or it was directly created by a higher power. In Baha'i approach, Kurzweil's evolutionary paradox is resolved by a differentiation between the spiritual and the material elements in human nature. The material component of humanity, namely the body, is subject to evolution while the human spirit is not. Overall, as Abdul-Baha teaches, I quote, there are 5 types of spirit: the vegetable, the animal, the human, the spirit of faith, and the Holy Spirit, unquote. All those forms of spirit are direct creations of God and cannot evolve or transmute into something else, including each other. Their limits are set, and they can progress infinitely, but within their own domain. Therefore, material evolution does not create human intelligence, but allows it to be manifested on the physical plane of existence by producing more complex bodily organisms that could accommodate it. Human spirit always existed in nature, potentially, even if undetected empirically. As Abdul-Baha puts it, I quote, just as man progresses, evolves, and is transformed from one form and appearance to another in the womb of the mother, while remaining from the beginning a human embryo, so too has man remained a distinct essence, that is, the human species, from the beginning of his formation in the matrix of the world, and has passed gradually from form to form, end quote. Furthermore, according to Abdul-Baha, the observation that material evolution leads to the emergence of human intelligence, in fact, attests to the idea that human spirit is not of material nature. To think otherwise would make us stumble upon rational inconsistencies. Here, Abdul-Baha presents his argument for that idea. In its logical form, it runs as follows. The first premise is this: what is present in parts should also exist in the whole. However, as the second premise goes, humans have intelligence, but the natural world as a whole lacks it. Therefore, the conclusion is that human intelligence should not be and is not part of the natural order. Now we can go back to the issue of identity and discuss it from the Baha'i perspective. So as for the second part of Kurzweil argument, it states that as part of the evolution, man could greatly enhance his abilities and transform himself into a new immortal creature of infinitely superior intelligence. This second thesis depends on the initial assumption about evolution being able to develop something higher than itself, a premise that we have already discussed as logically questionable. But in addition to that inconsistency, the second hypothesis involves the crucial issue of human self-identity that we must now explore further from a Baha'i perspective, as I said. According to Baha'i teachings, human intelligence or mind is the power of the human spirit. To use computer terminology, human mind is the interface between body and soul, between our material and spiritual natures. What are the philosophical implications of that view? First, since the mind, as Abdul-Baha says, I quote, is the power of the human spirit, end quote, it is not the seed of human identity. The spirit or the soul is. Human mind is the function of the soul. In the same way, our physical abilities and powers represent the function of the human body. Second, as far as the soul is not a material entity, but a spiritual entity, the power of the mind is also essentially spiritual and is only partially reflected on the physical plane of existence through the instrumentality of the brain. The limitations of the brain place substantial restrictions on the activity of the mind, which on the physical plane is mainly expressed through the functioning of reason and sense perception. According to Abdul-Baha, the potential spiritual powers of the mind are much greater than what human reason and sense perception are capable of. Those hidden abilities are only partially expressed through human intuition, visions, and dreams, which are possible due to the interconnection between the material and spiritual realms. A departed soul, for instance, may communicate with a relative who is physically alive, but this would be a different kind of communication, a different kind of conversation, because the heart of man or the spirit of man is open to inspiration or to spiritual communication. Now, just let me mention that Abdul-Baha cautions against premature development of those spiritual powers here on Earth while we are functioning in the material universe, but still those powers exist. Sometimes potentially, and for some people, some of those powers may be actualized. So in view of this, let us revisit the issue of technological singularity from a Baha'i standpoint and its implications for the future of humankind. Would it be possible for humans to increase their intellectual capabilities by inventing a machine with intelligence that supersedes their own? In my view, yes, it would. This would not mean, however, that humans have evolved into a different super-anthropoid species. In the process of evolution, we have already created a great deal of machines that increase and in fact surpass our own powers. Cars run faster than humans, telescopes possess sharper eyesight, cranes lift heavier weights, and so on. The difference between physical and sensory abilities on the one hand and the power of human mind on the other is that we tend to associate our self-identity with the mind. If we imagine the invention of artificial intelligence that overtakes our own, we may conclude then that we are able to transform ourselves into something or someone else. From a Baha'i perspective, however, I think, this would not be the case for a number of reasons. First and foremost, human self-identity, which is expressed on the physical plane through self-consciousness, is not a material but spiritual reality. Hence, no manipulation with or augmentation of human intellectual abilities will affect our spiritual nature. In fact, the invention of artificial intelligence that supersedes our own, which already happened in certain fields of human activity, such as, for example, the game of chess or the game of Go, will prove, on the contrary, that we are more than our capacity to reason. Otherwise, it would follow that nothing could produce something which is logically absurd. Second, and this is no less significant in my view, as far as research into artificial intelligence remains within the limits of matter, even the emulation of the whole human brain would imply only the capability to simulate some of our intellectual capacities, while the hidden psychic powers of intuition, visions, and most importantly, revelation would continue to be inaccessible to humans. Now we can return to Kurzweil's two thought experiments and evaluate them from a Baha'i point of view. Let's imagine that our technology is capable of scanning and downloading a complete replica of the human brain. Would such a you be really you? In my opinion, no, it would not. because no material emulation of the brain will be able to capture the spiritual essence of the human being. A material replica will always remain what it is, an incomplete copy of the person that is lacking the source of that person's identity. Then what if we are able to replace someone's brain with an artificial brain implant? Would that person retain his or her identity? The answer to this question, in my view, depends on whether the implant is capable of retaining a mysterious connection between the spiritual and material parts of the human being. Regardless of technological success in the field of artificial intelligence, however, no one will ever be able to change their own spiritual identity or to create an artificial intelligence that supersedes humans on the spiritual level of existence. Now, a couple of remarks in conclusion, and you see Sophia, the most advanced social robot today. If you have not heard about Sophia, please Google this robot and watch various short videos. She has the face of Audrey Hepburn. She could smile, and she could cry, and she could make a good conversation. She could crack a joke. And she was also the first robot who was granted citizenship. She became a citizen of Saudi Arabia. So a couple of remarks in conclusion. In the 21st century, humanity entered the second wave of robotic evolution by having developed artificial intelligence, which is capable of learning from interaction with the environment and from its own mistakes. So that was very important. Many thinkers and researchers of artificial intelligence are now warning about the inevitable competition between humans and robots, a competition in which artificial minds will supersede the intelligence of their inventors and eventually render them and all of us helpless and powerless. A Swedish philosopher, Nick Bostrom, in his best-selling book Superintelligence: Paths, Dangers, Strategies, addresses those challenges by discussing various artificial intelligence takeover scenarios and possible human responses. Yet, in my view, this is not the only present and clear danger that humanity is facing. So this is not, in my view, the only present and clear danger that humanity will be facing as a result of the superintelligence explosion, which is looming on the horizon, indeed. Many artificial intelligence scholars and inventors, such as Ray Kurzweil, dream of the era of singularity that promises not only the augmentation of human physical and mental abilities, but also the prolongation of human life to the point of practical immortality. It may as well happen that science and technology will deliver a desirable outcome and extend human life indefinitely. We may also in the future develop the abilities to rejuvenate ourselves and remain young and healthy for a long period of time, if not forever. However, what we won't be able to accomplish, in my view, by scientific, technological, or any other means, is to eliminate suffering. Suffering and pain come to human beings on different levels and in a variety of forms. Suffering cannot be separated from life and is inevitable because it serves as an instrument of spiritual growth. Hence, the transhumanist project of achieving physical immortality would in reality mean the creation of hell on earth. How else could one describe an existential situation which is constantly testing our endurance with no end in sight? And what is hell if not such an unending suffering with no prospect of release or light at the end of the tunnel. Now, here are my sources for the presentation, and I will conclude now my talk, and I will be delighted to answer your questions.
This is absolutely fascinating, Mikhail. I am delighted by this. Of course, as a science fiction writer and follower of many science fiction stories, this has been something that I've thought about for quite a long time. In fact, I was even thinking of writing a novel when I was about 16 about the person who finally invented the possibility of cybernetic immortality and battles between the ethical battles that would come up in their team and everything. But of course, I didn't have the capacity to write such a novel when I was 16. More recently, I don't know if have you ever seen the TV show The 100? I'm curious.
No, but I'm aware of many TV shows that develop this kind of ideas, because in my estimation, transhumanism replaced postmodernism as the most avant-garde cultural movement, and obviously it has so many repercussions in art.
Yeah, in the 100, they invent this little device that they can stick in the back of your head, which will download all of your memories and thoughts and everything. And then when the body dies, they can stick it into another person. And then eventually that device takes over the brain of that other person and wipes out their personality. And so this allowed people to live forever, but only if they basically stole bodies from younger people. And that generated some very interesting ethical problems and conflicts, as you might imagine, in that particular story. Yeah. So that's an example of where this kind of argument can go, actually, this kind of approach. Several things occur to me. The first thing that occurs to me is the question of whether you can actually, quote, download, unquote, consciousness. The human brain may very well not be patterned the same way as computers. And it may very well be that you can't simply create chips with the kind of flexibility that neural networks have. I don't know. It may very well be that the way human brains think is sufficiently different that we would really have to develop a totally different kind of architecture. That might be possible, but I don't know.
Yeah. Yes, this is probably the most devastating critique of those artificial intelligence writers and scholars who believe in the church Turing thesis that our brain is basically a computer. Yes, there was an American philosopher whose name escapes me now, who wrote a famous book that was called The Critique of Artificial Reason, What Computers Cannot Do. And this book was republished in 1998, I believe, by the end of the 20th century. The second edition was called What Computers Still Cannot Do. And his critique was philosophical, and it was based on the idea that humans think and operate in real life not on the basis of algorithms, that we have a way to make decisions in the situation where there is no strict line between the input and the output.
Right, determinism, right,
yes,
shall we say.
We may understand the situation and act in the situation with no rules, no prearranged rules. And that's why today, in the 21st century, artificial intelligence scientists actually focused on this idea of how to train robots to act and make decisions in a situation in which they have to learn from various factors, and the situation will be indeterminate, etc., etc. So that produced the second wave of robots, and Sophia is the most advanced social robot, can actually do a lot. Have you ever heard the videos of Sophia the Robot?
No.
you should Google it because it is very creepy. If you do not see her as a robot, you may not be able to distinguish her from a human being.
Huh.
She's joking, she's singing, she is up to the topic. She's very sharp, and she's sometimes sarcastic. Once one interviewer asked her what are her next plans, and she responded, "Well, my next plan is to take over the world and make you humans my slaves," and that was a joke. So that was very impressive.
Huh. Well, then my second objection to Kurzweil is I don't know if the U2 could ever do exactly the same thing as the U1. And I think we just got to exactly that point in your comments. If you think that there's a certain randomness in people's responses to things, I would think that if you ask an extremely complicated and difficult intellectual question to U1 and U2, they could very well give similar but nevertheless different answers. Yeah. And in that sense, you can never be sure you've really emulated U1 correctly.
I always ask my students about this, and my students came up with an interesting view. They said that in the beginning, you too may be like you and may behave like you, but from then on, you will have different experiences.
Yeah.
And therefore, you will develop in two different ways, and you still will become two different persons or two different entities. Now, by the way, Robert, should I stop sharing the screen, or should I continue sharing the screen?
I think you can continue sharing it because there are a couple of questions in the chat, and there's some Q&As, and people may ask about specific slides.
Okay.
So I'll see what we have here now. This person said it's such a wonderful talk. This is interesting. Some reference to vaccines and transhumanism. Bill Gates, vaccines and transhumanism. David Knight is joined by Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, discuss the agenda of Bill Gates about vaccines and transhumanism. Mandatory vaccination precludes religious beliefs. No, that stuff is not worth repeating, I think.
Yeah,
I think the rest of that is...
much about Bill Gates. Yeah,
that doesn't strike me as a serious discussion. I apologize to the person. Someone wants to know whether this has been recorded. Can we have the PowerPoint slides? And I suppose, yes, we'll put them up.
Yes.
On the Woman Institute, generally what we do is each web talk has a web page, and we will put the link to the recording there. We'll put the link to the PowerPoint there, and perhaps we can even get a transcription using this new technology that you have and put it up there as well, if you'd like. This person says, I worry that today there might be a plan to implant, maybe by force, chips to do certain things, including reduce the great amount of populations. I'm not sure. There's certainly no plan to do that, and I'm not sure how you would do it either.
Yeah, I don't think, well, I'm not a scientist, but I don't think we are at this point of scientific development when we can do this, especially on a mass scale.
They already have ways to manipulate.
I see a question. Do you believe that body and souls are chosen one for the other at the time of conception?
Yeah, that's interesting.
Or it is a random selection? I simply don't know. I have no idea. Because we still don't know the nature of the connection between the body and soul. And therefore, we really do not know what death is. In 19th century, death, let's say, was not reversible when you had a heart attack. Nowadays, when you had a heart attack, God forbid, your death can be reversible. And in fact, what was completely irreversible in the 19th century, in the 21st century, may well be reversible. And we do not know what will happen in the 22nd, 23rd century. Maybe what we now have as irreversible death may be reversible in the 22nd century. So the philosophical question is this: at what point death is really irreversible, no matter how much we advance as scientists? And there is no answer to this question.
Right.
And also there is no answer to the very simple question: what is the nature of consciousness and self-consciousness? We still don't know what is it. And if you are in a hospital, the only way for a doctor to check whether you are conscious or not is to ask you. And there is no other way. There is no machine that actually registers the presence of consciousness. Yep. It is a very simple question, but it is not resolved by science at all.
Right. That's a fascinating example. And you talked about the whole idea of whether the brain can be augmented. And that would be already they're talking about the possibility of helping people, for example, who are blind, to be able to see by giving inputs into the neural network. And so in that sense, we're already looking at ways of doing sort of, shall we say, brain add-ons to supplement what the brain can do, but perhaps now is limited. That does raise the interesting question whether we couldn't get a calculator built into our brain as well, or at least attached to it, so we could think the answer of very complicated multiplication problems and things. Or possibly, well, as it is right now, you can speak in one language and have it transcribed fairly well, translated fairly well into another language. It could very well be that you might be able to think it in one language and have it come out of a box in another language. I suppose that sort of thing is possible because they're already looking at ways with sort of mapping the head to people can now think things actually and move cursors and things just by thinking.
Yes.
So they're already coming up with ways to attach devices directly to the brain via a helmet type of a device. So there really is some really amazing technology that will help a lot of people with limited, mobility or limited ability to hear or see. And then it's very hard to say what will come from that in another century.
Yeah. So here is, I see another question. If our minds are a function of our souls, which does not reside in the body, how could it then be downloaded to some external device? This is a very good question. So you can, again, this is all hypothetical. But hypothetically speaking, we can download something that is material. So if, let's say, we say of mind as being a general abstract concept, of some of our mental powers, like memory, volition, etc., thinking. Therefore, again, we do not know how our soul is connected with the body, but this connection produces some effects in our brain that become material. And when it comes to the material brain, we most probably can replicate, or it's called re-engineer, how it is working, and therefore we may be able to download memories, and we may be able to download the pattern of thinking. The problem will be with the will, with volition. This is another problem, like consciousness. We have no idea how will happens and how it is working, but when the brain is mapped completely, I think it would be possible to replicate the human being. My point is that scientists won't be able to replicate the source of my identity. The source of my identity cannot be replicated. But if the scientists can give me a brain transplant with my memories, my will, my pattern of thinking, my emotions, and be able to do this in such a way that my identity will be revived, then it will be possible, but my identity will not come from the brain. That is my point.
I wonder, in fact, there's another thing that I've often thought about. I wonder whether a silicon mind is as capable of making connection to the human soul as an organic brain. Silicon versus carbon-based brain. We don't know the answer to that either.
No.
It may very well be that the mineral kingdom has some tricks up its sleeve we're not aware of, you might say.
Yes, that is true.
Who knows? Who knows?
We are approaching a very strange age when life will be changed dramatically. So let me see other questions. I have many questions.
Do transhumanists believe in the existence of the soul or God is one question, and do they think about the existence of creatures beyond this planet?
As I said, most transhumanists, from what I've read, are secular people. So they are either pure secularists or atheists or agnostic, the majority of them. There is a minority of transhumanists who are trying to apply this new science to their religion. But they are usually in the minority. Now, the way secular transhumanists are approaching this issue is by saying that we do not have a soul, but we have a psychological pattern by which we think, feel, store memories, etc. And this pattern is relatively independent of the brain. So it can be taken from the brain and switched to another platform, and therefore it is possible to preserve it. So that's what they are trying to do. They are trying to achieve physical immortality. I have serious problems with the idea of physical immortality. As I said, it would mean infinite suffering.
Yeah.
Because you can never avoid suffering.
Yeah. And that raises the interesting question here, how or has suffering been translated into the artificial intelligence framework, or examples possibly from Sophia? Does suffering have a construction, theoretical or otherwise, in this artificial construct?
That is a good question. I've seen a lot of interviews with Sophia. I think the emotion that she could display is not suffering, but something like displeasure. When you say to Sophia that, let's say, humans are higher than robots and she's only a robot, she will be displeased with that. I don't think she will suffer because of that. So suffering is a very, very tricky thing. Because it may occur to humans on very different levels, not only through physical pain, but through emotional pain, through psychological pain, through spiritual pain, etc. And it is a very, very difficult thing to re-engineer.
Yeah, through conscience, through your conscience.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be very hard to.
A lot of people are talking about mandatory vaccines, COVID vaccines and chips. I do not know anything about that. So COVID is a totally different topic. And I'm pretty sure I don't know about Bill Gates and who is trying to implant some chips as part of the COVID vaccines. I personally, I don't believe it.
Yeah. I'm looking farther down here. How is intuition or intuitive thinking constructed in our brains? For example, how did Einstein develop this theory of relativity? That kind of thing.
We do not know that. And the power of intuition in spiritual thinking is usually attributed to the person's connection with the spiritual world. However, in modern thinking, intuition is understood simply as an intuitive exploration of your own unconscious. It is when you are not aware of certain knowledge that already exists somewhere, and the brain is working without your conscious effort and produces this result out of some kind of source, not spiritual source, but maybe some other source that exists. So if you take intuition in the second sense, then you may reconstruct it. That's what robots do. They reach to their data bank, and they come out with some kind of conclusion or with some kind of idea, etc. But religionists, people who believe in any religion, usually would say that intuition is a higher ability, and it has nothing to do with subconscious, but it has something to do with superconscious, with your connection to the spiritual world.
Yeah, I think the best example of intuition solving a scientific problem that I'm aware of was the man who was trying to figure out the chemical formula for benzene, which is C6H6. And in a carbon chain, you can't have C6H6. You have to have, C6H12. You have to have the C6H14. And then when he went to sleep, he suddenly saw a snake biting its tail, and he woke up and realized that benzene was a ring. And that by doing that, you had the right number of carbons and the right number of links and the right number of hydrogens, so that instead of having the two ends dangling where you have to have a hydrogen, you close it up, you don't have to have those extra hydrogens, and you have C6H12. So that's the sort of thing, it's almost like the brain playing with information that it already has in ways that you might not be able to do while you're awake. So that's an interesting possibility. One person says, isn't it like comparing apples and oranges to compare a silicon brain and a carbon brain? Well, that would be especially true if we had any idea what a silicon brain is. And one question you hadn't answered was whether transhumanists believe there might be life on other planets.
Oh, yes. No, I haven't read transhumanists being concerned or obsessed with life in other planets. Nicholas Fiodarov, who was dreaming of resurrecting all people who have ever lived here on Earth, was thinking about space travel. But aliens, the main concern of transhumanists is to achieve immortality, practical immortality, not complete immortality, but practical. The difference is that you are not immortal, but you will die in 1 million years. And practically speaking, 1 million years, it's enough. It's enough to consider it, to consider yourself immortal. So no, they are dealing with this life, this earth, but to me, transhumanists are much more interesting than postmodernists because transhumanists came back to basic philosophical issues: the philosophy of mind, the philosophy of human identity, the philosophy of human nature, and they believe in discovering some truth behind it, while postmodernists reject the very idea of truth with the capital T.
Yeah, somewhere I had heard that if you studied life insurance actuarial charts, I think it was, that if a person didn't die of the usual, cancer, heart disease, and heart attacks and diseases, but only died from accidents, the average person would live something like 500 years or something like that. So you can't avoid accidents, but you in that sense would still presumably face an end at some point, but it might be quite a long time into the future. Not sure what you would do with that many careers. We get tired of having the same career for that long, I think. And other people would get tired of you occupying a niche in that career too, and them not being able to explore that area anymore because you have your own ideas and you have the reputation that everyone else has to listen to, which is what tends to happen over time.
Yeah.
I don't see any other particularly interesting questions here related specifically to this. topic. But we have been going now for almost an hour and a half, and we usually try to end it around an hour and a quarter to an hour and a half. So I want to thank you very much for this fascinating presentation. I'm sure we will see this discussion continuing in many places, and of course we'll have this recording up on our YouTube channel. And we're looking at the idea of doing a whole series about the future, so that might be a place people can also turn to for further information. We don't now have any more web talks for, well, I think we have one next week as well. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thanks again, Mikhail, and
thank you,
everyone. Have a good remainder of the weekend.